In this video, we're going to look at adding a UI slider as a feedback for the player on their progress of collecting the spheres or whatever collectible you have in your game. Now, sliders can be used as an input device, say for adjusting volume, or they can also be visual feedback, which is what we're going to do in this tutorial. So first thing we're going to do in our scene view, we're going to double click on our canvas, and we're going to add in a couple things here to our canvas. So here in my upper right, I have text that displays the number of spheres I've collected. I want to make an addition so that there's a slider that just kind of shows a visual progress. So maybe I've collected 7 spheres, but that's only halfway through, so there's some feedback to the player. To do that, we're going to get a little organized here. So on a canvas, we're going to right click, add UI, and we're going to add a panel. And I'm going to shrink this down to, I don't know, something like that. Press F to zoom in. Now this panel is going to take in this text and the slider. So we need to add a few components to it. So what we're going to add first is a vertical layout group. And so what this is going to do is stack all the children in a nice column. So I'm going to drag the text object into my panel, and you can see it'll snap to the top left. And the reason it's snapping to the top left is because my child alignment is upper left. You can change that as you need. And in this vertical layout group, you can adjust the padding. You can also adjust the spacing between children. There's a few other options here that we'll talk about here. I'm also going to add my slider. So I'm going to right click on the panel, UI, slider. It's pretty common for it to not put it into the right place right away. So we can grab that slider and drag it onto the panel again. And then it'll put it in that column as we go. Now, a few things that we'd like to have happen here is we'd like this panel to adjust in size. This text, when we push play, doesn't read new text. It says spheres collected, and then it's got a number. And so we'd like this panel to fit that text. And to do that, there's 2 things that we need to do. We're going to add a component, the content size fitter. We're going to choose a horizontal fit to be preferred. And what that's going to do is adjust the parent to fit the children. And we want to do that vertically as well. Nice and tidy. All right, and you'll notice that we changed our position a little bit, and that's because of our pivot here. So we're going to take this object, put it back in the corner, and then we're going to move the pivot. So if you can't move this blue dot up here where it says pivot or center, you can toggle until it says pivot, and then drag that pivot up to the top corner. And now the object's going to grow out of that top left corner so that it stays visible. We don't get any gaps around us. The other thing we need to do here is on the control child size on our vertical layout group, we need to check the width object. And what that's going to do is force all the children to be full width of the parent. So we got a little bit of interplay here. The content size fitter is going to make the parent fit the largest child. And this is going to make the effectively make the smallest child fit the parent. So if we push play, we can see how that's working. You can see the spheres collected. Our panel grew to fit that whole text, and the slider grew as well. So it looks pretty reasonable. Next thing we need to adjust is our slider object here. If we open that up, we find a handful of children. So again, as I said, this is designed to be an input as well as a visual feedback. And this handle, this dot right here, we don't need because the player's not making any adjustments. So select the handle slide area object, and we're just going to turn it off. If you delete it, Unity can get a little unhappy. I'll zoom in here a little bit more. Let's go back to the parent object, the slider, and the slider component. So what you'll see here is transition options like we had with the button, various colors. But at the bottom here are the slider specific parameters. So we can choose our direction. We can have it go from right to left. We can go bottom to top. I'm going to leave it as left to right, but you can make those changes. The min and max values are pretty self-explanatory. If you had maybe a volume slider, your minimum value may not be 0, your maximum value may not be 1. so you can make adjustments to those. We're going to have it so that Playmaker is going to be adjusting our maximum value dependent on the number of spheres that we have. You can force integers or whole numbers. Playmaker treats sliders as floats, or treats the values as floats, so we're going to leave it unchecked. And the value here is just the value of the slider. So if I move this back and forth, you can see in the UI it adjusts as well. Now, if I push it all the way up to the maximum value to 1, you notice that there's still a small gap here, which is not what we want. And normally that's filled by the handle. But since we turned our handle off, that's not helping us. So we need to click here on our fill area, and we're going to just size that up until it covers the entire background. And then it'll look the way we want. All right. I'm going to change the color of that background to make it a little bit easier to see. So I'm going to click on the background, and then it's just an image. I'm going to make it maybe just a little pink, or let's go a little dark like that. That's probably even easier to see. And now, you can also change the shape of the slider here by changing the source image. Right now, it's just kind of this default 1990s bubble. You can put something in there that suits your design ideas. So there you go. We've got the basics of the slider set up. The next step will be to add a FSM to get some interaction. So we'll do that next. So we're going to add a bunch of interactivity here that's going to make our life a little bit easier once we've got it created. So this max value on our slider is equivalent to the number of collectibles in our scene. Now, it's not that hard just to come in and say, hey, I've got 20 collectibles, I'll make this max value 20. But maybe you edit the scene a little bit and you delete one of the collectibles and you forget to update your slider. Well, then your slider's off. Or maybe you add another collectible and you don't update your slider. So what we're going to do is have the collectibles themselves effectively update this maximum value. And then when the collectible gets collected, it's going to update this value. So it's going to be doing all the work on its own. And that's going to take a few steps. So let's get to it. So we're going to start by putting an FSM on our slider object. So select your slider, go to Add Component, FSM. And I'm going to call this Progress Slider. Just renaming the FSM. And I'm going to rename the game object the same, Progress Slider, just to keep things nice and organized. I'm going to press Edit to open up our FSM in the Playmaker window. Now, the first thing we want to do when the game starts is make sure that our slider's value is set to 0. Right now, I've been playing around with it. Maybe I forget to set it back to 0. Again, the idea here is we want to automate as much as we can in case we mess something up on our own. So what we want to do is set this value to 0. That's all that's going to happen in this first state. To do that, we need to go to our ecosystem browser and download a couple new actions. Now, I've already done this. So if I search for UGUI slider, you'll see that 2 of these actions are highlighted, showing that I've already downloaded them. So the actions you want are the UGUI slider set value and UGUI set min max. So download those, let Unity compile. Once you've done that, in this first state, go to your action browser. We're going to search for UGUI slider, and we're going to set the value. So drag that into your state. Game object is the owner. Our FSM is on the slider, and we're going to set the value to 0. So we're all good. That's just going to reset it. The next piece of functionality is that when the game starts, or the scene starts, each collectible says, hey, I'm here, and lets the slider increase its maximum by 1. That way the maximum stays in sync with the number of collectibles. Now to do that, the easiest and best way to do that is to use what are called global transitions. And global transitions are events or transitions that can get called by any FSM anywhere in the scene. It just makes for a really convenient messaging system, if you will. So we're going to go to events, and we're going to create a new event. We're going to say register sphere. Okay, register sphere. Add that in. Now, really important, we're going to check this box here underneath what looks kind of like a broadcast or Wi-Fi icon, and that's going to make it global. See, if I hover there, I have a global. So we're going to add a new state. Okay. We're going to call it register sphere. And we're going to add that global transition. So we're going to right click, add global transition, register sphere. And you can see what we get added looks very much like the start event, because the start event is itself a global event that gets called by Playmaker. So every time we call this register event, we're going to come in here and do some logic. So what we need to do is increase the maximum value of the slider by 1. So to do that, we need to create a new variable that's going to be the max value. So let's go to variables, max number of spheres. Again, leave it as a float. And we're going to add that in. Come back to our state. And we're going to want to add to that float. So we're going to search for float add that action. Select the max number of spheres. We're going to add 1 to it. Then we need to search for uGUI slider, and we're going to set the max and min. Make sure that happens after the addition. So again, the game object is the owner. That's great. The minimum value, we're going to hit the equal sign so we can type in a number. We want to make sure the minimum value is 0. And the max value is going to be the max number of spheres. Okay. Now we need to adjust our collectible to actually call this global transition. So click on your collectible sphere. In my scene, you can see here that I've gotten rid of all but one of my collectible spheres, and there's a good reason for that. So before we make an adjustment to this FSM, we need to do something so that Playmaker will be nice to us. We're going to turn this collectible sphere into a prefab. So we're going to drag from our hierarchy this collectible sphere into a prefab folder. We did something similar with earlier bits of our UI. So we're going to drag that in. Oh, I got a little warning from Dropbox. And then when we do that, the text in the hierarchy will turn blue, indicating that it is a prefab. Now, this just, as far as I can tell, this is just a little bit of a fluke with Playmaker, the way it works. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete this out of the scene now that I have a prefab, just to keep things neat and tidy. I'm going to delete that out of the scene. And we're going to work on the prefab here in the project folder. So I'm going to click on that, then open the Playmaker window. Sometimes it doesn't snap to. And there we have the FSM on the prefab. Okay, so what we need to do in here is have this sphere register itself. It needs to call that global transition. So we're going to add a new state, and we're going to call it register self. And then in this state, to call that global transition, we need the action send event. Add that in. Now, the event target is the object that has the FSM with that global transition. We know it's not the self, so that's not the correct option. If we click there, we can see a few more options. The one we're going to want in this case is the broadcast all. Now, there's maybe more efficient ways to do this, but for our purposes, this is going to work really well. And what the broadcast all does is it broadcasts to every FSM in the scene. Says, hey, I'm calling this event. If you have it, then you need to do something. And the reason that's not necessarily the best is because it's broadcasting to every single FSM, and that can potentially cause a lag spike. We can optimize ever so slightly by excluding ourselves. We know we're not calling it on ourselves. And then we need to choose the event that we're calling. It's not a local transition, it's a global event. And so we're going to call register sphere. And you can see for some reason Playmaker is holding on to a bunch of old global transitions that I've been working with. So make sure you get the right one, register sphere. Now, once this piece of code has been run, we are going to want to go back to wait to be collected. Okay, so two things that we need to do. We're going to add a regular transition, finished. So when this is done, we're going to go over to wait to be collected. But we also want this state to be the first thing that we do. So we're going to right click on it again and set as start state. And we look something like that. So we're going to call start, we're going to register ourselves, they're going to wait to be collected, and all should be pretty normal. Now there's going to be one other additional problem here. If we click on the collected state, this audio play action has lost a parameter. Normally here in this slot here where it says none game object, we had dragged this FSX manager, the sound effects manager, into that slot so it would play the clip that's attached to it. The reason that's gone empty is because the sound effects manager is an instance in the hierarchy and this collectible is a prefab in the project. And they can't see each other by simply dragging and dropping. One easy way to fix that is to simply turn the audio action off. But if we still want that auditory feedback, we're gonna have to do a little bit more work. So we'll do that next. So to fix this disconnect that we have with the sound effects manager, what we have to have the FSM do is go out into the scene, look for the sound effects manager by name, store it as a variable, and then we can use that variable here in this slot. So to do that, we need to create a new variable. I'm gonna call it sound effects manager. Make sure its type is set to game object. Press add. And we're going to go back to the state and our action browser. We're going to search for find game object and drag that into the top. And now again, like I said, we're going to search for it by name. It needs to be exactly as it is in the hierarchy. It's case sensitive. So sound effects manager. And then we're going to store it as the sound effects manager variable. And then down here in the audio play, we're going to hit the equals so we can choose a variable. Sound effects manager. And it should all work nice, as well as registering it as we had looked at before. So what should happen now is when this collectible is in the scene, when we start, our progress slider here, the maximum value should match the number of spheres in our scene. So let's see if that will work. So let's go back to our scene. And again, I've deleted all the collectibles out of my scene, and I'm going to drag this sphere into my scene. Okay, so I've got 3. And when I push play, this progress slider, the max value should go up to 3. And there we go. We got a max value of 3, and you may have noticed the slider went down to 0 as we reset itself. So the next piece here is when we collect these spheres, we want it to tell the slider, hey, your value needs to go up by 1. So let's go ahead and set that up. Click on your progress slider, hit edit to open up the FSM. And once again, we're going to add another global transition. This is going to get called whenever we collect a sphere. So we're going to go to events. I'm going to call this sphere collected. And again, make sure that button is checked. I think it auto-checked because I already had, for some reason, Playmaker's doing something a little weird. It's holding on to events that were already deleted. So make sure that's checked. And we're going to add a new state here. So we're going to call this sphere collected. And in this state, what we need to do is add to the number of spheres that have been collected and then update the slider value. So to do that, first we need a new variable, and it's going to be spheres collected, and it's going to be of type float. We're going to add that. Back into our state, we're going to search for an action of float add, and we're going to take that spheres collected, or spheres collect. That's a little bit of a bad name. Let's fix that so it's a little bit clearer. Spheres collected. Okay. And we're going to add 1 to it. And then we need to simply update the value of our slider. So interaction browser, search for UGUI slider, and we're going to set the value. Okay. Make sure that happens after the addition. Again, the game object can be the owner since our FSM is on the slider. And we're going to set its value equal to spheres collected. All right. And we need to add in the global transition. So we're going to right click here, add global transition, sphere collected. And there we go. Just like we did before, we need to call this event from our collectible. So I'm going to click on the collectible in my prefab folder. Again, not the ones in my scene. I'm going to select this collected object state. And in here, we need to once again call the send event action. And it doesn't really matter where this is as long as it's before this activate game object action. Because this action here is turning off the sphere. If we call the send event after we've turned the object off, it will never get called. So I'm going to drag that in just before. And then I'm going to, again, choose broadcast all. We're going to exclude ourselves because we know it's not on ourselves. And we're going to choose global events and spheres collected. And again, I'm not sure why Playmaker's holding on to all these. You should not have all these global events. Here's sphere collected. Okay. And let's go back into our scene. Now, something we need to do, we've changed the prefab here, but we haven't necessarily changed the instance here. And Playmaker seems to be playing a little weird at the moment with prefabs. So I'm going to select each of these prefabs and hit revert and make sure that it matches the copy of what's in the prefab folder. So let's push play and see what happens. Okay, so spheres collected goes up and our slider also increases by 1. So there you go. We've created a progress slider that updates its maximum value. It also updates its value as you collect something in the scene. This can easily be changed to work with something that's not just the collectibles. You could have a maze maybe where you're walking through triggers and it updates to show you how far you are. Lots and lots of different ways to use this. Hope that was helpful, and I'll see you guys next time.